Hello and welcome to GovTech Viewpoints. My name is Teri Takai and I am excited to be here with you today because we're going to really have a topic that everybody's kind of thinking about and talking about, but we're going to get some real interesting conversation about what it really means. I'm joined by HP's Dan Gohl for another interesting and fun conversation. Now, just as a reminder, each episode of GovTech Viewpoints explores one big question facing state and local government decision makers as they adopt the next generation technologies. Dan and I will be breaking down the latest news and the biggest trends and explain how they impact state, city, and county leaders. Now, Dan, one of the things that is kind of talked about on the fringes, if you will, of the AI conversation is how are we really going to have the compute requirements? And what does that mean from a power consumption standpoint? Now, we're seeing governments actually vie, if you will, for new data centers. But again, the demands for those data centers and compute power means that there has to be the energy capability, but also that those of you that are in the business need to make sure that we have the hardware ready for that across the enterprise. So let's talk about kind of the infrastructure shifts to support AI at scale, the evolving role of the data center, and then what that really means for state and local CIOs. So let's just dive right in. I mean, what do you think this means, as AI compute power just explodes for the future? And what are some of the things that governments writ large should be thinking about?
So hello, Teri. Thank you so much for having me. So honored to be able to be here with you. The question that you ask is profound, not just because it's the responsibility of a CIO and their leadership role in getting their governance board, be it an executive branch official or guiding the legislature in terms of doing things, or a mayor or city council, that we have an infrastructure to use data as a utility. And that's very different than the way in which we've treated things in the past, where sometimes it's been necessary, but able to be controlled because it was all consumption based. What we were basically doing was using the World Wide Web as a retrieval network, as a giant library of, I'm going to go and get information that my employees or my citizens need, or I'm going to publish it out there. So there were very few spaces where power was actually consumed. It basically came down to three things. Could I keep my web servers up and running? Could I keep the connections to them up and running? And then could the end user, either on a laptop or a mobile device of some kind, a phone or a tablet, process that information? But those are all light consumption modes, because there's not a lot that needs to be done in order to retrieve something that already exists. In 2025, we're seeing a tremendous pivot to where now compute power is needed to generate new content, perform new kinds of analytics, be it facial recognition as part of your security, be it part of the analytics to look at what your electricity or water consumption or other resource consumption is within your custodial staff, be it in generating a fresh response through a chatbot to a citizen who's looking for where they can get a business license or register to vote or get a real ID. Once you are generating a unique response to each of these, you've got multiple forms of intensive energy utilization, what we call power, right? Energy per unit time, that's going on across the chain. And so now we've got to worry about how is that energy being produced. Now, as a former physics guy, what I'll say is that energy is conserved. So what we're doing is we're converting it from some form to another, right? Whether it's hydroelectric power, be it petrochemical power, be it solar, be it wind, whatever it is, we're generating power that's usable to us. And we need enough of it. And data centers, because of the intense nature of the compute, are incredibly energy intensive. It is estimated that by the end of this year, AI will be using as much energy as the entire country of Japan. And we are just getting started in terms of the penetration of AI capabilities into our, not just our economy, but our entire culture and the way people are going about doing things.
Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, to finish it, once we generate it, we got to transmit it. And right now, we're only running at about a 10% efficiency rate in power transmission across our
really? Wow.
lines. So there's a lot of engineering that needs to be done there. Then we've got to worry about how we are utilizing it, whether or not our endpoint devices, our servers and computers and other things are efficient and, sipping that straw with as little as possible. And then third, we got to have redundancy. We got to have storage. We got to make sure that we can have power on demand when we need it, which really only gets tried in times of crisis, be it in a hurricane or other things where your core services need to be running. And as more and more core services are AI dependent, we cannot just do remote AI. And so while data centers will be the leading piece for general consumption, that's not true in the public sector. We're going to need high utilization and high access to locally generated energy sources. And we can go down this road. There's a bunch of things going on out there, from small fission reactors to gravity well storage with big blocks of concrete in city centers. But paying attention to how you get your power, how you use your power, is going to be one of the most important aspects for the CFO and CIO to discuss moving forward. And one of the solutions is the hybridization of compute, moving it from the data center into local devices, in particular, the kinds of things that servers used to do for the web and data storage now are being done by workstations in terms of AI. And AI can run remote, it can run off a local workstation, or it can run off an endpoint device, such as a PC. So putting that whole hybrid approach together to balance your risk, and risk management is one of the most important things in the public sector. We got to make sure that we approach the power, compute, connection as a risk management challenge.
Dan, I really loved your comment about, we always think about the compute power to actually perform the function, if you will, or to support government. But your point about storage and the ability to ensure that we have resilience, or quote, disaster recovery, as we used to think about it, is kind of a secondary part of that. And it's really going to mean that the way we thought about disaster recovery and backup is really going to change.
100%. So here we are in the summer of 2025, and we already have heat domes sitting over large parts of the country. I will tell you that in major metropolitan areas today, they are browning out or shutting down energy consumption in neighborhoods because the air conditioning demands alone are overwhelming the infrastructure in our cities. And if that's shutting down parts of your police response, your fire departments, that's unacceptable. Yeah. So what people need to do is to begin to think through who has access to power under what conditions. It's one thing to shut it down for residences. It's something else completely to shut it down for public safety. Yeah. And so building an infrastructure that is resilient but also tiered, power gets weight in terms of who's getting it when. We need to keep our cooling centers for the public open all the time. We need our hospitals to have power, but we may not need our libraries to have power at the same priority. Has the CIO talked with the folks within the operating to make sure that they can direct power where it needs to be? And that's not even under a disaster recovery scenario. That's just day-to-day operations. And what happens when your power supply company just simply tells you they don't have enough power for you? Do you have self-owned power generation capabilities? That's another aspect that people need to start really thinking through. The long-term solution to any kind of centralized problem is better decentralization. Decentralizing power generation is something that has not happened in this country in 100+ years. But now it's back.
Interesting. So let's talk a bit about what you mean by decentralized power distribution. Kind of give us a little more about, for someone like myself, what does that mean? Am I going to have power generation at home? I don't know, how does that actually instantiate itself?
Yep. So let's think about the Hoover Dam, which was kind of the pinnacle of engineering marvel, where we were able to take the gravitational potential energy of water and turn it into power for the entire west coast of the United States. The Hoover Dam powers everything west of the Rockies substantially. And what we have from that is a highly centralized, everybody's using that capability. Well, over time, people began to realize that, that's not quite enough. So they added in nuclear, they added in wind, they added in solar. But again, they were all feeding it into a common grid, and it was controlled by your power electric company, right? Be it in California. And this energy distribution in the United States is primarily controlled through the state governments. So states would sign agreements to pass power from, Utah into California and all of that. Well, now we're having to say we need power to be able to be generated and used locally. And this kind of began with solar, where people may put solar panels on their home and then feed power back into the grid because they're no longer using it. They're contributors rather than consumers.
Right.
But that's not at a sufficient scale for AI.
Yeah.
And so very large geothermal projects are emerging, where people are using the temperature difference between the surface of the earth and 100 meters down, a football field length below the ground. You can take that temperature difference and generate power. That can keep a hospital running if it is turned off of external power grids. Wind power, as long as you've got a way to store it, and there's some amazing technologies which are on the horizon to greatly get away from lithium, which is a difficult power source or power storage capability, and begin using solid state power storage, putting electrons into solids instead of liquids. By 2030, the power game is going to be radically different. And our public sector needs to be prepared to obtain the new technologies that will keep them energy independent from crises. It builds in redundancy, it builds in security, but because so much of the compute they need to do is done locally, it's actually going to save them a lot of money. There's a little bit of upfront cost in order to develop local, regional power supplies, power distribution. But a lot of people have closed down coal power plants. What's interesting about coal power plants is that, we may not want to use coal because of its difficult impacts on the environment. We've already run all the infrastructure there to distribute the power from those sites. And every county in our nation at one point had some form, be it windmills in the not windmills, hydroelectric in the Northeast, where New Hampshire and Vermont had their own local power generation in the 20s and 30s, all of which were shut down. Much of that infrastructure still exists. The copper's already been laid. We can use what was old, refresh it to power the 21st century AI revolution.
Interesting. Well, Dan, let's go back from sort of that vision of where to be. because it's a little bit like, are there enough electric power stations or power stations to actually keep my electric vehicle going? It's kind of yes, I know that's the vision, but where we are today. So let's think about today's CIO who is sitting there with kind of moving some of their stuff to the cloud, right? Having some of it on-prem and sort of having this hybrid environment that they have to deal with. And now they're thinking of hybrid in a way that you've defined it, which is a little bit different from cloud and data center, but it's also taking into account sort of where that compute power is all the way down and out, if you will, to the end device. So if I'm a CIO, how should I be thinking about, should I move more to the cloud? Should I be thinking about, more on-prem because it has more flexibility? Kind of what should be some of the ways I should be thinking about some of my near-term actions to actually be able to prepare for the future?
So the answers, I'll use the plural to those questions, it kind of depends on the degree to which you are going to be using artificial intelligence at scale. If most of your work is build a model once and then let people consume it, the cloud can still, for the foreseeable future, the 3 to 5 year time frame, be very cost effective. But if you have an intent of having your end users, and by that I mean your social workers, your law enforcement, your fire department, be able to utilize AI in real time in order to solve public service problems, then you need to push that compute power, and that means that energy consumption, as close to the end user as possible. It's more efficient. There's less wait time. We talk about a term called latency, right? There's less latency in terms of being able to get the response. And people can do their job even when they don't have network connectivity, because cloud access is 100% dependent on network connectivity. If you need people to be independent and still have AI capabilities, whether it's pattern recognition or generating recommendations, and the militaries face this tremendously when it comes to battlefield AI deployments. They are working very closely across the services, the Army, Navy, Air Force, about how do you address and give these capabilities, but not put people at risk if you lose things. All of that technology is now being commercialized and made available to the public sector. And so the civilian utilization of what was previously military grade technologies is letting CIOs strike the right balance between what kind of compute, where that compute is done, because the where drives the energy issue. You also use a lot less energy and pay a much smaller total cost of ownership by having the compute in-house. You pay a premium with cloud-based distributed AI because of the intensive energy nature of the high-end compute at the remote data center, but mostly because of transmission costs. We've already referenced the huge energy loss that happens. And every bit and byte that you're transmitting from afar has embedded in it that energy loss rate of going through the power lines.
Interesting. Well, then you mentioned and you referenced sort of in the new version of the hybrid environment, basically the end user device. But clearly that means that those devices, whether it's an IoT device or whether it's our usual traditional laptops that we're using, are going to need to really increase in compute power. And in fact, the software is going to need to keep up with that in order to have that distribution happen. So is that what you're seeing now? Are you seeing companies?
100%. And I want to put something on people's radar because they're going to start hearing a lot more about it if they haven't already. We are in an era where what are called ARM chips, right? These reduced set chips that so many of our providers, the Intel, NVIDIA, AMDs, all those are, that are going into HP and other OEM devices. And what those use is a reduced set between literally the flow of electrons and the magic that we make happen with Word and Excel and other things. Well, there's now an open source command code that is based on what was formerly proprietary. It's called RISC-V. And in much of the world, and now beginning in the United States, many private entities are beginning to build both computers and Internet of Things, that IoT you referred to, devices based on RISC-V commands. This is going to be like the breaking up of a monopoly in terms of what happens. And as you as a CIO begin to be able to realize that not only can you determine how technology is used for your municipality, your state government, your higher ed institution, but you can actually have people on your staff design their own chipsets to determine how that is used. It's a democratization of the most fundamental computing technologies. And as we are coming up, we're only about 25 years away from the first century of having, silicon-based processing. We're coming up on that. We're going to be entering a world where more and more people can develop their own chipsets.
Wow.
Their own devices. And those municipalities who take advantage of that soon are going to see reduced cost and higher customization, which is exactly what people want. Now, the skill set for those people still comes at a premium today. That's going to start dropping as the laws of supply and demand take over this marketplace. So it's not just the power, it's not just the compute capability, it's literally the ability to do compute that's going to be at your fingertips as a CIO to think through how are you going to build that in. Right. And the more local control you've got with high degrees of interoperability, which is what international standards produce, the more flourishing of our communities we're going to see. Wow. And we certainly look forward to this day when distributed power plus distributed compute means unique solutions that are addressing the needs of our communities.
But as you think about it, Dan, you read my mind because I was going to ask you that question about skill sets. I mean, clearly, the CIOs are struggling with just replacing or getting the skill sets with today's technology. So how do you see...
It becomes a really interesting circular problem, right? Chicken or egg, what could you need? But the game is that AI is our new coding infrastructure. And so literally the use of AI to develop better utilization of AI and power problems and compute design challenges, it becomes not a chicken and egg problem of frustration, but rather we can bootstrap our solutions by doing our initial deployment. We're already seeing a tremendous change in the growth rates of economies that are adopting AI quickly, growing at over 3%, versus those right now that are not, which are flat at best in our current economic conditions. We expect that bifurcation to continue even more. And that's not just a macro level trend. That is going to be a micro level trend. Those government agencies that deploy AI, including to accelerate their adoption of AI, are going to see greater efficiencies, both in terms of financial as well as in terms of service delivery.
So let's do a crystal ball, if you will, on that, Dan. So, kind of if you could say in the next 5 years, what are 3 steps that you feel that CIOs are going to be taking to get to that vision? And then maybe what's in the next 5 years after that?
All right, so let's start with the first one. Right-sizing your compute and energy consumption challenges at scale right now means sharing. Do not treat your government agency or even state government as the sole customer. look to having the state government and county government share the generation challenges in the AI compute. The unit price cost of AI chips will drop within 5 years to where we can really go our own way. But right now, to do the initial adoption, find partners. If you're a higher ed institution, partner as a state university system, not just as your own institution. It's expensive to do the initial outlay. Share it. That's how you can right size. I believe that we are going to need to be willing to put power generation within our residential and commercial zones the way that we currently have transmission facilities throughout our cities. If you drive in any rural or urban or suburban area, you see those big coils and wires all coming together because that's how we get the power to run our houses. Well, next to those, you're going to begin seeing other forms, whether it's geothermal or wind or solar or, micronuclears, it's being called, 300 megawatt power stations. All of these are going to come into our neighborhoods, and we know what the not in my backyard, the NIMBY crowd fights are going to be. But we've got to start educating our communities about the need and the benefits that are coming from this. That's what the CIOs can focus on. Wow. The other thing is they're going to need to upskill their workforce. They need to, as much as possible, get people to utilize AI capabilities now, because the gap between what is needed and what is possible and what people can do is only going to grow. And so we're already talking about leaving AI as a human user behind as we move into an era of AI agents, right? Where people are programming small pieces of AI that are going out and making decisions that may have previously been made by a mid-level bureaucrat about turning water on and off or turning power on and off. This 20 years ago revolutionized the way Wall Street works. Well, the same fundamental compute capabilities are now being turned to all kinds of civic challenges. They are much more complicated than just doing the marginal difference in a stock price. These are human measures. There's a lot more risk. There's a lot more challenge. But we need policies, right? In 5 years, the big challenge is going to be the availability of quantum computing. And how are we going to blend quantum computing capabilities, which are also putting at risk much of our safety and security, are the way in which we use prime number factorization to provide security. We're going to see more and more technology turn to analog, facial recognition, and other things. It's an arms race on the negative side. It's climbing our way towards a fairer, more just society with technology benefiting all on the positive side. Which side of the coin, the flip of the coin, lands on is going to depend on how well our civic leaders today educate their population, commit resources for continuous change and evolution, and realize that as much as possible, they need local energy, local compute in order to not spend too much and minimize risk.
Yeah. Wow. Well, Dan, thank you for those kind of closing comments, because I think that's one of the things that is always tough, is to know, what are specific things that CIOs should be thinking about and doing. Well, Dan, I can't believe we've come to the end of our time. I love this conversation, and I loved your broad-reaching perspective, which I think we tend to think of compute power, but we really don't think about the transmission piece and how that impacts how the overall infrastructure looks. I think we can all think back to, this isn't quite the same, but it's sort of the next version of, remember when we talked about client server and we talked about that distribution of compute power. Well, now we're talking about it in a much different setting, but many of the same principles and challenges are really out there for all of us to consider. Well, it's always such a pleasure.
Teri, I'm going to end with this. I mentioned data as a utility near the beginning. There was a time when running water, everybody thought they just needed one spigot in their house. And now we have as many bathrooms as bedrooms in our homes because we've got water as a utility everywhere. There was a time when people thought, well, I just need an electric light in my house. And now we have multiple plugs in every room. So if you've got a resource that is a utility, people find new ways to use that utility, and they need it everywhere. The same is true with data and data analytics, data generation. That's what the AI revolution is portending, is information as a raw commodity like water and power. And so you got to build your infrastructure out in order to make that future happen.
I love that, because it really, as you say, it focuses on the resource, not necessarily the technology, which is AI, to actually be able to make use of that information.
AI is just the faucet and the light bulb and the use case. It's the information and the data behind it that is the raw material.
Outstanding. Well, Dan, again, thank you so much. I love these conversations. They are so much fun. And thank you, everyone, for listening to this episode of GovTech Viewpoints. Be sure to subscribe to the series on LinkedIn, YouTube, or Spotify, so you'll never miss an episode. So please join us again for our next GovTech Viewpoints, where Todd Gustafson and I will be exploring some really interesting topics. So Dan, thanks again. And thanks everyone for joining us. And we'll look forward to seeing you again soon.
Thank you, Teri. Thank you, GovTech.